Welcome to the Sag Harbor Cinema, the inaugural projections, which is the very first time we've ever done this, which is a get-together here on our third floor, where we engage with other non-for-profit organizations and interesting people in our community and invite them to kind of come in and we hope to amplify their voices. This is an initiative that has been central to the mission of this cinema since before this building was even built. It's taken a long time to build the building, and we thank everybody here who's been involved with that. I'll keep my remarks short. My name's Bill Collage. I'm one of the executive board members, and to my right is Dr. Jennifer Morgan, who's my fellow board member. Jennifer is the professor of history at NYU. She is the chair of social and cultural analysis, and her most recent book is, she's author of many books, but her most recent is Reckoning with Slavery, Gender, Kinship, and Capitalism in the Early Black Atlantic. And she will introduce our very special guest today from the Plain Sight Project. Thank you guys for coming, and this is the first of many, many of these we hope. Thank you very much for supporting.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many people out here on a rainy Sunday. Welcome to today's discussion of the Plain Sight Project, which is, you're going to hear more about it, but it's a project that's dedicated to comprehensively identifying enslaved persons and free black residents of the East End of Long Island from the 1600s to the mid-19th century, and to preserve burial grounds, habitations, and work sites, et cetera. It's my pleasure today to both introduce David and Donnamarie, which I'm about to do, one second, and to moderate this afternoon's discussion after their presentation. I'm very proud to be able to facilitate this conversation. I'm a longtime summer resident of Sag Harbor, Sands adjacent, and for many of you known mostly as Maymette's granddaughter. And I'm a professor of history, and by my connection to the board here has been this amazing opportunity to be involved in the community in this new way. And I'm very excited that the cinema is so committed to hosting events like this as well as wonderful movies. So keep that in mind. I am going to introduce David and Donnamarie, and you all have note cards and pens, and that's for you to, jot down a question or two if you have one as their presentation unfolds. At the end, the three of us will have a little conversation ourselves, and then I will moderate the questions that you all have posed. So just keep those in mind. So let me begin with David Rattray, who is the owner and editor of the East Hampton Star. He is the fifth member of the Rattray family, over 3 generations to have held that post. He attended the Hampton Day School in Bridgehampton in his early years and graduated from East Hampton High School and then Dartmouth College. Before taking over the family business, he worked as a field archaeologist for the American Museum of Natural History, which makes me feel that your connection to this project, like I understand a little bit more about your connection to being a historian. He worked for Design Division, which is a museum design firm in Manhattan, on projects for the Catawba and Mashantucket Pequot nations before returning to East Hampton in 1998 to work at the Star. Donnamarie Barnes is a lifelong summer and now full-time resident of Nineveh Beach in the Sands Historic District of Sag Harbor. She is the co-director with David Rattray of the Plain Sight Project and the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island. She has worked as a photographer and a photo editor at magazines like Essence and People magazines and at the international photo news agency Gamma Liaison. Her current photography work focuses on the beach landscapes of the Sands community and photographing the landscape as memory at Sylvester Manor. So please join me in welcoming them. And I will say, I feel there's like 2 or 3 seats over here if anybody wants to scooch in, but we can just proceed.
Yes. Anybody want to move? Okay. Thank you so much for coming. This is overwhelming completely, and so fabulous that you've come out today on a Sunday afternoon to hear us talk about this history. that's so important to us. It's incredibly moving for me to be able to have this opportunity to speak to you today in this historic space that means so much to all of us who live in Sag Harbor, this movie theater where I grew up seeing all of my favorite movies in summertime. It's an amazing, it's just amazing. So, thank you, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction. And every time somebody introduces, says, I'm going to introduce David and Donnamarie, my brother's name is David, and so that's always... we are the Plainside Project, which David started 4 years ago in East Hampton. And we basically fell into this work really by chance and circumstance, and since then have been dedicated to uncovering the names and counting the enslaved and free people of color of the East End of Long Island. And this spring we had a meeting here at the cinema with Jennifer and Bill College, and they invited us to do this talk, which we were very excited about, but realized that we hadn't really started researching in Sag Harbor at all. And so we had to begin to find the stories to be able to tell to you this afternoon. And within the 2 months that we've been really looking into this, we have found the stories that we were looking for, and we have found the names that we hadn't known before. So to begin, let me just tell you a little bit about the beginning of Sag Harbor. This area, Sag Harbor, was the ancestral land of the indigenous people of the East End of Long Island, the Montaukets, the Shinnecock, and the Manhasset people of Shelter Island. North Haven, which was known as Hog's Neck, was part of a sale to Englishmen from Southampton by the Manhasset people of Shelter Island in 1665. And Sag Harbor was part of that sale. The beginning histories that are written about Sag Harbor speak about that briefly, without really diving into what the culture was of the indigenous people, what their relationship was to the land and to each other. There's a lot of description about Sag Harbor as a place of, it was called the Great Meadow. And the Algonquin word for it was, Waganok, which means the place at the end of the hill. And the topography of this land is described as swampland and marshland, great meadows, and very high series of hills. So to lay out this land, which was needed because it was such a natural harbor, and with the planning and the occupation of Sagaponack and Mecox as farmlands, taking goods to the harbor in Southampton was no longer really a viable choice. And Sag Harbor was that natural deep harbor. And so it was needed to transform the land in order to be able to lay out the roads, to have lots for homes, and to create this harbor anchorage. And so there's always a lot in the history, the written histories of Sag Harbor, that talk about this change in the landscape. And then you get to the end of the chapter, and then it goes on to the days of whaling. And you say, well, wait. You filled in a swamp, you cultivated a meadow, you moved massive hills and a 50-foot cliff that ran along Bay Street? Who did that? Who did that? Did you forget to remember? And that's where we began, to look for that information that somebody forgot to remember.
So I should maybe talk, excuse me, just a little bit about the process, which really began as a mistake. I had written in the Star, in my column, about a man named Ned, who was enslaved and then freed, and has a gravestone. He's one of two people of enslavement who have headstones in East Hampton. And I wrote a column that said, "Nothing will ever be known more about Ned." And I got a phone call. And it was on behalf of Loretta O'Ryan, who is a historian who's written about the famous Goody Garlic witchcraft affair in East Hampton. And Loretta relayed that Ned was, in fact, all over the town records. He was everywhere in the trustee records of East Hampton, a book that I had on my shelf. And the summer of 2017, I asked an intern, because listen, now, because there aren't photocopy machines anymore, you have to actually find things for interns to do. So right, we used to intern, and we would get coffee and run photocopies. So I asked Briley Williams to transcribe the church records of East Hampton, looking for any names of what appeared to be people of color. Sometimes there would be a notation that would indicate it, and sometimes you could just sort of tell from the kinds of names, which we can talk, the naming of enslaved people, sort of remarkable and weird. And very quickly we went from Ned, and we knew about Peggy, who was buried in the East Hampton South End Cemetery. Briley had 330 names on the list within about a week. And basically, at that point, we just sort of fainted, and then the hard work began, which is to figure out who they were and what did it mean. We didn't even know. Very often, someone might be described as Colonel Mulford's girl, Nab, N-A-B, and we didn't know what that apostrophe S meant, and we had to learn, and we had a lot of help along the way. And in the process of doing so, now we've confirmed the identities of 250 enslaved people in East Hampton, and another about 510 Southold. We haven't begun work in Southampton yet. Bridgehampton. We haven't really included the Shelter Island enslaved people. And that's, by the way, this is Native people as well as people of African heritage, firstborn, second generation, third generation. So we're up now to roughly 770 enslaved people that we have in a ongoing list on a database. And along the way, we met Donnamarie, and there was a certain synchronicity with the work she was doing in Sylvester Manor and we were doing in East Hampton. And I think the confluence here in Sag Harbor is not just a curiosity, but there is a certain geographical and geographic and economic reality to the nature of the economy in the colonial period and early Republic period, pre-whaling, that is represented by Sag Harbor and the stories here. And it's been a remarkable collaboration. And I think part of the thing is we've been able to begin to draw together groups. I don't know if you would agree, though, that groups maybe that weren't talking to each other that begin to, East Hampton and Sylvester Manor were sort of distant in the present day, which is not defensible in the historic record, the closeness of it. So,
well, I think it's something that's happening not just here, but it's happening statewide and maybe nationwide. The subject of slavery in the North, when I started at Sylvester Manor as curator 5 years ago, I would spend the winter going to other historic houses in the New York area, and for many reasons, to see how they put on exhibitions, to see what kind of lighting they had, and mostly to see what they talked about in their narrative. And most of the time, at the end of the tour, I would have to say to the docent, but what about your history of slavery? You're saying that this was a 17th century Dutch plantation farm that provisioned Antigua, but you have not mentioned who did that work. And they would look at me, cock their head, and say, well, we just don't know. Or we don't have enough records, or we don't know enough, or we only have a couple of names. And it got to the point where I started to say, to not say anything is the disrespect, because that was another excuse. We don't want to be disrespectful. Well, it's disrespectful not to say anything. To show the respect, you say, we don't know a lot. We know that they were here. We know that they were part of this place. We are working to change our narrative, to look for those names. And now, 5 years later, that actually is happening a lot more in most historic homes and museums and house museums. because they can't avoid the history anymore. And you come to realize that it's not such a mystery. You just didn't look at those records in the right way, or you were looking for something else, and so you skipped over that name that said, you know, Patsy Negro Cook, because you were looking for a recipe for something, or, you know, a butter churn. But once you start going back, it's literally on every page, in every line, and that's what I found when I went to the John Germain Library, because I didn't know anything. I was reading Sag Harbor history books, and there was no information there. And the wonderful archivist who had been at the John Germain Library, Rebecca Grabby, said, let's look in this book. This is the Sag Harbor Presbyterian Church records written by Caleb Cooper in 1725. That actually goes from the early 1700s to 1725. And there on the page said, Luce, colored woman, Cato, colored man, paid to sweep the church and ring the bell. And that's how it started. And within an hour and a half, I texted David and said, I have a list of names. We have a start in Sag Harbor.
Yeah, I wish I could sort of hand it out, but Donnamarie eventually sent me a Word document of these names. And particularly what was very striking is that the back end of, we're jumping way forward now, this list of manumissions. And this is around 1800. New York is gradually ending slavery. And by gradual, I mean over the course of a generation, over the course of a lifetime for someone who's indentured. So the idea that New York sort of snapped a finger is not true. But what's striking about the list of manumissions are the names of the people doing, both the names of the individuals who manumitted, but the names of people doing the manumitting, like Hunting and Rose and Deering and Jagger and Corwith and Rogers and on and on and on. Stanborough. I don't have my glasses on. I could put them on and keep going. But the point is that slavery was not something unusual in colonial and early republic America, that it began at the beginning of white colonization, of European colonization, initially with the enslavement of Native people. In East Hampton, among the earliest enslaved people we know of by name includes a girl named Hope, my Indian girl named Hope, who I think is part of a dowry, who comes into the Loper family, and I believe that's about 1679. There appear to be people of African heritage as well around that period. One of the more striking stories is you begin to see free people of color in those days. For example, there's Peter, involved in a land deal in Mecox in 1659. He's living on land somewhere around Watermill, and the town of Southampton wants the land and offers him a deal for some acreage over on the other side of Mecox. Now think about that. You've got a free black man involved in a real estate deal in 1659 in Southampton. What that says, that he and his enslaved brothers and sisters and enslaved Native people were here at the beginning, lending their muscle and their lives to the development of these communities that became the towns, that became the colonies, that became the states, that became the United States. And that we can demonstrate that these people worked side by side with the other people to make these communities and thereby made the United States. And this isn't a question of interpretation. This is straight up data. These are straight up dates and names. We have a young man described as a Negro boy, no name, who drowns in a pond on such and such a date. That's just a fact. It's in the record. You don't have to interpret that. You don't have to put spin on it. And I think that's part of the strength of our approach is, while we're very story-oriented, we want to know about people. We want to be able to say something about Drusilla Crook, who's enslaved in East Hampton by the Beecher family at the turn of the 19th century. And yet, the strength of what I think we're doing is that as long as the names are there and you're bringing them to light, it can't be argued with. It's that simple. And I just very briefly, I mean, the 1619 project, which the New York Times did, which is this wonderfully audacious thing, but that's premised on an argument. Whether you agree or not, the premise is American history began in 1619 because a group of enslaved people who had been captured by privateers or pirates or offloaded in Virginia, and therefore the elements that became the United States are all present at that moment when they step ashore. That's terrific, and I think I agree. But that's an interpretation. What we have, and it's an, I think the thing that we always have to watch out for are the big stories. Right. Frankly, Sylvester Manor, big story. Gardiner's Island, big story. That George Washington was an enslaver. But the fact is, it was ubiquitous. Yes. And that the normality of it in those days, that any person of means had someone enslaved, maybe more than one person enslaved, often in isolation from family, often in isolation from other black people, right. was utterly ubiquitous. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you have a broad enough set of information, of data points like this, it's just there. You can't argue with it.
Right. I think where we are now, and David mentioning the 1619 project, which is a wonderful endeavor, but it doesn't really talk about northern slavery and how ubiquitous that was to the economy of all of New England and all of Long Island and New York. And that omission, maybe there'll be a part 2, we can only hope. But that's sort of where we are filling that void. Telling these stories is the primary reason for our project, but as we get more and more further along, and as we learn more and more, we're beginning to see different kinds of connections. So yes, I work at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, which was the first European settlement on Shelter Island in 1651. And at one time, the site of the largest slaveholding of 24 enslaved people in 1680. And what we are beginning to see is how then that history then spreads out. So what family members then moved to Sag Harbor. When Shelter Island becomes a town in 1737, how are those relationships? We begin to see notations of Silas, who we know is an enslaved man for Ezra Lamadou, sent to Sag Harbor to have watch repaired. So there's movement back and forth. There's a record that we found very early on in East Hampton of Cato, who had mysteriously 6 pairs of shoes in 1 year. Well, what was Cato doing that he needed 6 pairs of shoes? He was probably walking to Sag Harbor and bringing goods back and forth. And so as we find these connections of how the villages and towns were interacting and what the economy really was, and as we start now in Sag Harbor, all of it is really becoming a light bulb moment of why Sag Harbor really was the center economically of everything that was going on in these little towns and villages all along. And the way that they were able to prosper and what their economy really was. So,
yeah.
queuing up.
So, excuse me. So Sag Harbor is this little whaling problem, which is when you think about Sag Harbor, you think about whaling, and there's all these wonderful historic structures. I was down on Bay Street this morning looking, it's kind of near the harbor master's office. There's one of those historic markers put up years ago, and you would think history began in 1800 with the rise of whaling in Sag Harbor. The fact is, there is more than a century before that leads up to whaling and sets the stage for whaling. And one thing that is clear, whaling's heyday here is we'll call it a 50-year period, maybe a 60-year period, that rides on the heels of an economic reality that is based on slavery, and that Sag Harbor's existence as a port is based on slavery. And this comes down to a single commodity, and that is sugar. Sugar is the oil of its day. Sag Harbor was a major port for the exportation of essentials that were needed in the West Indies for the production of sugar. And that ranged from food to cloth to wood to timber to sugar to salt beef and fish to live horses and oxen. So sugar is a labor-intensive process, both for the human laborers who are enslaved in the West Indies, as well as for animals who are used to crush the cane and get the juice, and that then the enslaved people would, with great expertise and not in insubstantial danger, refine down into ever increasingly fine sugar for export, mostly to Europe. But it really was the whole of the economy of British colonial West Indies, and consequently this large swath of the Eastern Americas were driven, that wealth was being created, that ports were being dug, that wharves were being built in Sag Harbor, specifically for shipping agricultural production from here to there. And the money that's generated on the backs of enslaved people there is used to buy commodities that in part are produced through the labors of enslaved people here. Sag Harbor and the United States, frankly, throughout the Northeast and eastern down to the Carolinas, is involved with slavery coming and going. And the idea somehow that this was some God-fearing former, subsistence farmers that suddenly magically became whalers isn't true. The shipbuilding industry here in Sag Harbor was premised on the development of coastal cargo shipping. And the economy, basically the upshot of this is if you follow the money on Long Island, it inevitably takes you to slavery. It is inescapable. It is that when antiquarian writers wrote about the heroes that made these places, they were not telling an economic story. But the minute you crack open an account book and you see somebody selling barrel staves to be taken to the West Indies, and a cooper going aboard a ship, a Gardner-owned ship that Henry Packard Deering is the supercargo on. I mean, what do you think those barrel staves are gonna hold? Right?
It's going to Haiti.
Yeah, they're going to Haiti. Salt fish and horses, and they're going to Haiti. But Antigua factors into this, Barbados factors into this. Flax that's being grown in East Hampton, that perhaps Cato and his 6 pairs of shoes are carting to the port in Sag Harbor.
And there's documents that say that they brought goods from East Hampton to Sag Harbor from Little Northwest Creek across the cliffs of Nineveh to the port of Sag Harbor. So who do we think was doing that? Somebody forgot to remember.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
One of the things that I think we often do when in American history classrooms is we imagine this line, this dividing line between the North and the South. And part of the crucial business that David and Donnamarie are talking about is that the sugar islands are completely given over to sugar agriculture. There's no land on which to grow food to feed the people who are working in those fields. And as a result, the importation of food, salt beef, et cetera, from the northern colonies is crucial, as alongside flax and clothing and everything that people need to keep their labor force surviving, barely surviving, is coming from outside of the island of Jamaica or Barbados or Antigua or Haiti. It's got to be imported, enormous amounts. And I think we collude in this idea that somehow slavery is part of a Southern history, when we forget to remember the economic connections between the North and the South. And the other thing I wanted to add as perhaps a new information or a reminder is that the city of New York in the colonial period, so in the 1600s, the proportion of household owners who also owned enslaved people is larger than in any other city in the colonial period except for Charleston, 43%. So house owners, people who are wealthy enough to own a home, own a person. It is a ubiquitous, David said the word ubiquitous a number of times, it's a ubiquitous part. If you are a person who has some resources, if you are a merchant, if you have goods that need to be carted from here to there, and you have the capacity, you own another person. It is the way business works in the colonial period. It is how we move land and goods and services.
You know, it's interesting to say, well, how do we know that this, you know, that every household had one or two people in it? Well, wills and probate records and household inventories, we know. We see bills of sale. We see runaway advertisements. There's a documentary trail that takes you right to people's names and the values assigned to them, which is, you know, it's interesting. We were talking about this before. Like when you do this type of research and you're looking through a household inventory, you know, one of 100 in a day, and you become a little bit numb. You know, there's the sheep and the bedstead. And by the way, they wrote down everything, you know, silver buckles and buttons. I mean, extraordinary detail. And you're reading through this, and then you get over to the column sort of where the livestock begin. You get down to the bottom of the livestock, and you see Negro Reuben, age 28, value 40 pounds. And you write it down in your book. You think, oh, that's neat. And then maybe later it begins to sink in that this was a person. You know, I had this experience recently writing about the 5-year-old Drusilla Crook, who's taken from her home and brought to take care of a baby in the Beecher household, which is in East Hampton. It's the actually Village Hall now was a place of enslavement. You know, I just sort of wrote it down, and Drusilla and her sister Rachel, but then it hit me later. Whoa, these are 5-year-old girls. Right. They were taken from their parents. You know, I think we all have this vision of enslavement, slavery as sort of this southern plantation, families being kept together, you know, there being a support system in place.
Just by the numbers.
Yeah, by the numbers. And that may or may not have been true in the South. I don't really know. It's not my area of expertise. But it certainly wasn't the case here. There was isolation and dispossession, families being separated, children being separated, husband and wives being separated was the order of the business, in part because of the nature of slavery here, which was to have 1 or 2 enslaved people in your home, on your property, maybe a maximum of 12 in East Hampton, a maximum of 24 at any one time at Sylvester Manor, maybe 18 to 20 on Gardiner's Island. But I think the human part of this sometimes is difficult.
Right. So we're also seeing now that after the American Revolution, is when most of the manumissions start to happen. And we're just really diving into why that was happening. The North is possibly taking on more of an attitude of being against slavery. Many of the leading families who were slaveholders were forced into exile from Eastern Long Island, all of Long Island during the Revolution, and had to live in Connecticut for a number of years. And when they returned, they were facing economic hardships, and so perhaps that's one of the factors that they no longer can actually afford to house and clothe an enslaved person, and so they manumit them. And so from there, from the list of manumissions that cover pages of the Southampton Town records, we gleaned a lot of names, which was exciting, but at the same time, all of the enslavers were those leading founding fathers whose streets, our streets in our villages and towns are named after. And they're doing this magnanimous thing of manumitting their enslaved people. And so for me, in this time period that I've been doing this research here and finding these connections, so now when I go by the customs house, as I did on my way here this afternoon, I don't just think of it as the customs house where Henry Packard Deering, who was born at Sylvester Manor and is the third great-grandson of Nathaniel Sylvester. It's the house where Lewis lived. And it's the house where Phyllis lived, who he bought in Southold. And it's the house where Hagar lived, who he manumitted in 1802. Henry Packard Deering is one of the, let's call him one of the most famous founders of Sag Harbor, as the first head of the customs house, appointed by George Washington himself, from this renowned family of the original settlers of Shelter Island. But what he is actually is a fifth-generation slaveholder. And he was also involved with, as David said, in this economy of provisioning the West Indies, going back and forth, selling goods in the West Indies. And one of his diaries that we got a lot of this information is held at the New York Public Library. We went on separate days. No one had checked out this diary probably since they donated it 100 years ago. And here within 3 days, the librarians were like, what is with this guy? But that's how it kind of works. And in this diary, he describes trying to sell these horses, and that he finds the society lacking, and the heat is abominable, and the bugs are driving him crazy, and the food is atrocious. But however, the dusky brown women are alluring. So Henry Packer.
No, it's really true. So you've got Fordhams, who are enslavers, and Fosters, all of whom are considered, I think it's among the first sort of home builders here are Fordhams and Fosters in Sag Harbor. So Daniel Fordham manumitting Dinah. These names are remarkable. There's Flora and Peter Prime and Peter Primus. Peter Primus is interesting. Peter Primus is manumitted by Colonel Benjamin Hunting, who's the father of Captain Benjamin Hunting, whose home is the Whaling Museum. And Colonel Benjamin Hunting ran quite a profitable business shipping everything you can imagine to the West Indies, including very often beef cattle and sheep and hogs that were ranched on Montauk that he has brought back to his homestead near Bridgehampton, slaughtered, put into barrels of salt. Now pause for a second on salt, because we think of the trade of stuff going down to, say, Bridgeton, beef going down to Bridgeton to feed. By the way, I think it was at its time was the largest city in British colonial North America, was Bridgeton, Barbados. Something like 10,000, 15,000 people, many of whom were middle class that had a taste for salt beef. They could afford salt beef. If we think that the enslaved people of Barbados are being fed salt beef, there's yet another thing coming. But salt, which there was a salt works on North Haven, but more significantly, John Hulbert records in an account book, John Hulbert of the famous Hulbert flag, hundreds of tons of salt from Turk's Island being brought into Sag Harbor. And for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper into the sort of relationship between the history of Sag Harbor and of the Caribbean or West Indies, there's a woman named Mary Prince who dictates a very profound and horrifying story of her enslavement, including years on Turk's Island working in the salt pans. And the labor was so brutal, they worked up to their waists in this highly briny solution of water all day, and their job was to sort of scoop the crystallized salt out of that and get into these wheelbarrows. And so at night, when they slept, they slept on boards. except that they had to weave little baskets or little hammocks for their legs out of the palm fronds because the skin on their legs was so destroyed by the labor in the salt. So when you see shiploads of Turks Island salt arriving in Sag Harbor, and you know about Mary Prince and what she went through, and then you see that same salt being used to pack alewives that are coming out of Ligony Brook, or some codfish or something to be shipped down to the West Indies. It's a painful and real connection to a history that we just hadn't paid attention to. And one last thing before, there's just something you brought about the South. It's worth remembering that King Cotton, that we think of as kind of, we sort of associate slavery in North America with King Cotton. Eli Whitney didn't patent his cotton gin until 1793. Slavery had been going for about 180 years in North America when Eli Whitney just gets the King Cotton off the ground. So
there's a lot here.
yeah, I need to sit down.
I think that what we're going to do now, first of all, thank you all so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you. I think that what we'll do is just do a few 10, 15 minutes of questions from you all. If you have them, you can pass your cards up, and we've got someone getting cards. And while that's happening, I just wanted to elaborate. Anything? Okay, we're gonna do. Here, just give them to me quick so I can start. Okay. Oh, that's a very good question. All right, so I have. We're going to do just a little bit of question and answering. So one of the questions here is, and I think that this is an important way for us to think about the stories that we do remember as opposed to the ones that we don't. The question is, was Sag Harbor a stop on the Underground Railroad? And a question about when slavery ends in New York, and whether you can talk a little bit more about the relationship between Gardiner's Island and Sag Harbor. Let's start there.
Well, no, let's see.
Let's start with the Underground Railroad, Donnamarie Barnes.
No, but I think you should start with the not there. You should start with why that question
Is not there?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so here in Sag Harbor, there is a belief, let's call it a myth, that this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And thank you, Colson Whitehead, for writing a book and calling it the Underground Railroad and being a Sag Harbor as your resident. However, we don't really have documented proof of that. So when you say, well, my town was a stop on the Underground Railroad, you very much, in a way, feel good about yourself. Because the Underground Railroad is a noble, heroic endeavor. It helped people escape their bondage and find their way to freedom. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that? However, if we're talking about the Underground Railroad pre-Civil War, so we're already in 1840 to 1865, let's say. Slavery, I'll answer the other question. Slavery was abolished in New York. Somebody say it. 1827. Thank you. Somebody's taken my tour. 1827. And that's actually the question that we both I get every day when I give a tour at Sylvester Manor. How come I didn't know that? How come nobody never taught me that? Well, if we're talking that slavery ends in New York in 1827, but existed here since 1640, that's a long time to 1827. And if only thing you want to talk about is how heroic we are because we may or may not have been a stop on the Underground Railroad between 1850 and 1865, Well, you're forgetting to talk about an awful lot. And for us, we don't have the proof of it. We don't have the documentation of it. What we do have the documentation of is that in 1725, Luce was paid 30 shillings to sweep the church and ring the bell. And for me right now, that's so much more important than whether or not we were a stop on the Underground Railroad. And knowing her name and celebrating her service here is heroic. And it is important because she's one of the founding women of work in this village. And that's my 2 cents.
What's the rest of that question?
Right.
It was
There was a question about the relationship between Sag
Gardner's
Harbor and
Island.
Gardner's Bay, and also there's another question about the relationship between Sag Harbor and Haiti. And I have a lot of questions, so let's be very concise here.
Gardner's Island, major producer of all kinds of goods, including cheese, lots and lots of cheese, horses. Native people in particular seem to be involved in horse husbandry on Gardner's Island, and sheep and wool, and all of those commodities are going somewhere, and they are largely being shipped out of Sag Harbor after the opening of the port here. Initially, they would be shipped out of sort of Northwest Harbor, but it's not a terribly good port. Sag Harbor, having deep water and having development of wharves by getting close to the revolution, at any rate, allowed you to ship products from Gardner's Island. The Gardner family, being very wealthy, were major ship owners, investors in other people's shipping, and the holders both on the island and across Long Island of many, many enslaved people.
There are a couple of questions about manumission and about what happens to the Black families. First of all, how do we, when we only have the first names of so many people, how do you trace manumitted or freed Black people further on in time? And then also, is there a relationship between manumission and citizenship? Like, do men who are manumitted become citizens automatically or not?
That's a good one. I'll take the first part.
I can do the second.
You can do the second part. So, when I find someone's name who's been manumitted, I treat it almost like a genealogy. And Ancestry.com is actually very helpful. Census records were started in the early 1700s on the East End. And so you can put in a first name. For instance, I always tell the story of Matilda, who was manumitted in 1795 from Sylvester Manor by the Deering family. And our friend Henry Packard Deering was one of 3, along with his brother Sylvester and his brother-in-law Nathaniel Gardner, who inherited Matilda and then manumitted her when the family returned from exile in 1795. Now, in the 1800 and the 1810 and the 1820 Shelter Island census, Matilda is listed as a free woman of color and a property owner, and it's just her first name. There is another woman listed with her, and she's listed as Violet Negro. So when I'm looking for what happens to the enslaved people that I've uncovered that are on my manumission list, that's the first step. Can I find them as just one name? After 1840, well, let's say this, pre-1840, family members are not listed on the census, only men or the property owner. So that's why Matilda is listed, because she has no acknowledged husband.
Well, one important piece that we do see in the records and we're beginning to see more of is that the single name of a father becomes the last name of a son and daughter. And so you begin to see prints go from a first name to a last name and things like that. Yeah. So we can also trace that. And we should give a acknowledgement to Jackie Dinan, who's doing the same work in South Old and Riverhead. She's done a lot of, and it's all available at the plainsightproject.org, but she's found some 3 generations. There's an enslaved man called Kedar, and I think she may even be into a 4th generation of descendants, which is really remarkable work. She's kind of putting us to shame, actually. She's really good.
Maybe because she's doing it full time.
Well, there you go. There was a question about whether there was work done on the North Fork, and so we just answered that.
Fantastic work.
I'm gonna try to. I've got a bunch of these, but I think they're all connected. And so there's a general question about what do you do? That this information kind of begs a conversation about reparations. How do you think about justice moving forward? So that's one. Another question is there a book or is there some other kind of thing in the works that you all are doing? And then finally, how can we help?
Okay, those are really good.
I'm writing a book.
Yes, he's writing the book. I keep saying, how's the book? As the work that we're doing expands, and it's getting really big, and now we're in contact with the folks doing this work on the North Fork. I've been able to involve Shelter Island a little bit more outside of Sylvester Manor, a little bit more. But we're starting to learn more and more. As we said, we haven't yet gone to visit anybody in Bridgehampton or Southampton, which will be a whole plethora of more information. So it's becoming huge. We do these talks more and more. The Zoom world of this winter and the never-ending Black History Month of February got the word out a lot more than we would have generally been able to do. So a lot of you are hearing our stories and learning about this history and understanding the importance of this history, that this was always, always a community of three cultures. Mm-hmm. This was diverse from day one when the English settlers decided that they wanted to live here and displace the indigenous people. This was always a place of diversity. It wasn't that, freed black people came here after the war to settle. They were always here. They came with the original founders. And if we start to recognize that, acknowledge that, and celebrate it, it's a hard history. It's painful. But it's also a history of survival and contribution. And when we start to acknowledge that contribution, that's the way forward. That speaks to the reconciliation. Learning these names, that speaks to the reparations of how we move forward and what we do next. And as David and I and Jennifer tell you these stories and you go away from here and you repeat them to your friends and your family, then it's out in the public. And now it's the public's responsibility to decide, what do we do about it? How do we recognize it? How do we change that historic marker on Bay Street to acknowledge the men who toiled to create Bay Street? So I was having dinner at the dockside last Saturday, and someone was asking me about, well, what are you going to talk about in your talk? And I said, about how where we're sitting right now was once a hill, and unacknowledged, enslaved, and indigenous people moved it. And they were kind of like, oh, how's the shrimp? So it's at a point now where it's become, what are we going to do about it? It's not what are David and I and Jennifer going to do about it. What are we going to do about it as a village?
But let me say that we had lunch. Jim Vredos, who's here, sat me down with Josh Franklin from Jewish Center of the Hamptons and Reverend Dr. Walter Thompson from Calvary Baptist Church. And we're sort of talking, we're going through the history, and there's this moment where, if not us, who? And I asked the question, well, do you think maybe it's time for us to step out of this, we're just data collectors here, sort of shield and do something about it? And we decided that as a trial basis with the three organizations, two faith organizations and Plain Sight, we were going to take a shot in East Hampton at putting bronze markers among the bricks in the village, real small. We're going to start with 3 people, it grew to 5. These things too. Just saying who lived here. And many of you probably know the Jitney Stop, eastbound Jitney Stop in East Hampton Village, little brick sort of patio. And we want to put one right there that says, here lived Jean, who was enslaved to the Reverend Nathaniel Hunting, and she died on such and such a date, and she was 1.5 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Little bronze plaque.
Exactly.
It's a statement of fact.
And it's an act of witnessing.
Yeah.
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 Thank you. Can you join me?
Thank you. One last thing. We will say, this is just the beginning. We are dedicating this year to Sag Harbor history. And so we'll come back next year and let you know more stories and more that we found. Thank you so much.
And one last thing is that the bar is open if you would like to move in that direction and have a cocktail. And I'm sure that David and Donna Marie will be happy to talk with you all individually. Thank you all.